Hello everyone, my name is Richard Missens. I'm a faculty member here with the School of Business and Public Admin. Welcome to our school. I want to talk a little bit today about case study method and case study analysis. It's one of the experiences that you will have when you come to our school. We are a case method school. And so what the case study method is, it's a decision-making tool that helps you to develop your decision-making skills. And so a case analysis is a scenario, or it's a story, or it's a timeline of events. And the nice thing about cases is that they're true events. And so case study analysis and case study method allows us the opportunity to put you in the position or the role of a decision maker. And we can have a variety of cases. We could have cases in marketing. We could have cases in finance, cases in management, cases from our First Nations communities, from First Nations entrepreneurs. And so in your time in developing your academic career and your management skills, you have the opportunity to be placed in a role play, which puts you in as a decision maker, as a manager, in all kinds of industries, in all kinds of contexts. And so it gives us a chance to kind of practice our skills at decision making. So the case study method is precisely that. When we tell you the story in a case, it's usually based on a timeline. We start with a little bit of history and kind of give you some background information on what led up to the challenge or to the problem, and give you some additional information that may help you in deciding or helping to make a decision. And then we turn it over to you. The other kind of case study is a case study where we tell you the entire story from background to problem statement to the recommendation or to the actions that the companies did. And we often reflect and say, how well do you think the company did in handling this situation? And so then that becomes a learning tool. But most of the case studies we'll use will actually stop at a certain timeline and say, okay, now we've got a problem. What would you do? And it's at that point where we begin to analyze the case and go into looking at the situation and thinking about how we would handle it as a manager. So the first thing you do in any situation and decision is identifying the problem. And sometimes that becomes part of the challenge of being a manager. When we're out there in our careers as management, one of the things I like to share with students is that you are going to be a lean, mean managing machine. And we train you to do that. We give you all kinds of tools to be able to do that. If organizations didn't have problems, they wouldn't need us. We are problem solvers. We're decision makers. So case analysis method allows us to practice and develop those decision-making, problem-solving skills. And the first trick is figuring out what the problem is. And in management, people are going to tell you all kinds of things. You're going to hear from all sides of the stories. And you have to decide, well, what is the problem? And sometimes we end up dealing with symptoms as opposed to the problem itself. And symptoms are things that result from something more deeper and more complex within our organizations. For example, we may say our problem is turnover. We have staff and employees coming in, they don't stay long, and we have a high turnover rate. So that we could very quickly say, well, that's our problem. But if we think about it more deeply, the problem could be we're not paying people enough, or our working conditions are difficult, or maybe it's me as a manager, I don't have good leadership skills, and as a result, one of the symptoms of these could be high turnover. So drilling down and understanding the problem in any kind of decision-making situation is very critical. And the case analysis method helps us to practice that drilling down and being able to get to the core of the problem. Once we've identified the problem, we need to analyze the situation. We analyze the information. Some of that information is historical. Some of that information is current. Some of it is financial. Some of it is political. And so we analyze all the information that's there. And a case analysis, a case study, provides you information, gives you an idea of some of the background of what led up to the problem, gives you a little bit about the future, maybe the environment, the context, the people that are all a part of decision making. Now, it doesn't quite tell the whole story, which is fine, because when we are managers, practicing managers, we often don't have full access to all information, so we end up having to make decisions as managers with limited information anyway. So it puts us in that context as well. But there is enough information in a case that can help us to begin to analyze that. And we need to look at that information and consider it. And the key around to analyzing information is to identify what the issues are. What are the issues in this case? More importantly, why are the issues? And once we have a good understanding of the issues, we can then begin to put those in context in relation to our problem. So analyzing the information becomes quite important in that. So once we've identified the problem and we've analyzed some of the information that's there, we now want to find some solutions. So we look for alternatives, courses of action that we can take. And in decision-making situations, there could be a multitude of different directions that we can take. Usually in the classroom, we'll ask you for 3. Pick your top 3 courses of action. So these become your alternatives. But as we move outside the classroom, we may find that we've got a lot more options at our fingertips, which is good. And that takes us to our next step. And once we have identified some really good, viable, plausible, reasonable alternatives, and the way I say that is, you can't come up with a $1 million solution if we don't have $1 million. So alternatives have to be plausible, reasonable solutions or courses of action to address the problem that we've identified. So they have to fit within the context of the organization, the capabilities of the organization, and the resources that we have, our capacity. So it has to be something that fits in that sense. So we as instructors, will help coach you and guide you through that kind of working with alternatives. So we have to evaluate them in that way. Also, we want to look at the pros and cons. There's no perfect answers in decision making, but there's some pretty good thought out answers, and that's what case analysis is about. It forces us as decision makers to think a little bit more about the problems in front of us, the information and the context around us, and the possible solutions that we have. So we're forced to slow down just a bit and think about these a little more closely. So evaluating them with pros and cons, yes, there's good things, but there's also some things that we have to be prepared to look at. And the cons could be, maybe it's got additional costs, maybe it's going to take a little more time, maybe we have to build some skill sets or some capacities before we can implement the preferable solutions. So things like that we have to keep in mind as we're going through. Once we've evaluated our best alternatives, we need to develop decision criteria. So imagine we had a list, a really good list of 10, 15 plausible and reasonable and acceptable solutions to our problem. How do we begin to choose the one or the two that are really going to be working? And the other thing about alternatives is they're usually, I'm just backing up a bit, they're usually mutually independent. That means they can happen independently. They're not related to each other. And they're usually mutually exclusive. If we choose A, we usually forego choosing B or implementing B. So because of our limited resource capacities, we can usually do one or two. So we need to decide, how do we select from a number of very plausible, reasonable choices? And decision criteria help that. And we just develop them from our analysis, and we develop them from the context, and we develop them from the kind of problem we're dealing with. So for example, if it's something that's important and urgent, maybe timing. Maybe one of the ways we select is we need a good solution that we can implement right now. Or maybe it's resource constraints. We need a solution that fits within a particular budget. Or maybe we're dealing with morale, and the solution needs to build or encourage employee morale. Or we're dealing with a media firestorm, and it has to have PR value. So we think about those things, and then that helps us to filter through all of the alternatives or the possible solutions that we might have in making a decision. And at the end of the day, as managers, you are charged with decision making. You have to make a choice. Sometimes they're tough choices. The choices have pros, but they also have cons. They might not fit all of the decision criteria we have. There are factors around decisions we have to consider. But that's your job, is to make that decision. But by now, we've thought about the problem a little more closely. We've looked at the information given to us, we've analyzed the information, we've identified the issues, we've generated some very plausible and reasonable solutions to the problem. We've evaluated those. We've identified the decision criteria, and now you make a decision. You make a recommendation. You select one. And once you've made a decision, our last step is to implement and to develop the implementation plan. How are we going to implement that? When we evaluated, we identified some cons. If it was a cost, it had a little extra cost, we have to identify where the resources are going to come from. If it was a little more time that needed, maybe it takes more time to implement this, we've got to be able to build the framework that outlines the time frames that we need in order to make sure that all the resources are where they need to be, when they need to be, and to let people know this decision is coming, but the solution is a little further down the road. So all those cons we identified become a part of the implementation plan. So we can take full advantage of the pros, we can address the cons of the alternative, and hopefully we address the problems. So that's case analysis in a quick overview. It's a decision-making tool. It's an experience I think you're going to enjoy as part of the classroom and as part of your own career development. I know as a manager and some of the other work that I do, I rely on case analysis a lot. It's a great tool to have in your managerial toolkit. I think you're going to have great fun with it. I think you're going to enjoy it, and you're going to develop some really good decision-making skills. So thank you for taking the time, and all the best.